All right. Well, let's jump in. Angus, good morning.
Good morning, Chris. Good to see you.
Yeah, me too. I've been looking forward to this for a really long time. I'm excited to jump in.
Yeah, I am too. Well, I'm pleased to see that, as always, you have an immaculately curated background. And of course, I look once again like I've been dropped to the bottom of a concrete pit. But this is actually the inside of my research lab. People are often asking me, like, what does it look like inside your lab? They have these various kind of, exciting imaginations of what it's like inside a research lab. And I can report back to you, it's the ugliest and most boring looking place on earth.
I love it. Well, I really appreciate your time, and yeah, we'll go ahead and jump in. We got Bill dialing in from about 2 blocks away from me. Good morning, Bill. We got Jenny, Kate from Columbus, Amanda from Brooklyn, Ben from Virginia, Christy from her gorgeous house in Sandpoint that I'm super jealous of. We got Trent in DC, and Joanne and Angus are dialed in. Good morning, Angus, and Tina. So it's a different Angus, I think.
Well, let's hope so. I mean, it's a great name, so I certainly hope there's more people out there who have the name.
Well, awesome. Well, to jump in, just first things first, a little bit of background. Most of you know me, most of the folks on the call, but I'm the founder of The Storied Future. I'm based in Seattle. Really work at the intersection of storytelling and leadership. So I got my start really in narratives for complex corporate transformations. So how do you align everyone around a new future? And then discovered by a happy accident the transformative power of storytelling for leaders and helping them write their narratives as they navigate transitions and transformations. And along the way, my pro bono work is with combat veterans in therapeutic storytelling. And I came across Angus's work and was just immediately struck by it. And we've been in contact for quite a while now, and now been wanting to talk to him for forever. So now here we are. And we're going to be talking about his new book, Primal Intelligence. And we'll jump right in with Angus, and he'll give some more of his background in a minute. But he's professor of story science at Ohio State's Project Narrative. I'm not going to give away too much more because it's part of the story in the presentation. But if you could hit the QR codes to sign up for the newsletter on atomic storytelling, my work, if that's something you're interested in. But definitely, if you could click that code and pre-order the book from Angus. As a thank you for attending today, you're going to receive the first chapter of Angus's book. So that will go out right after we meet today. We're also going to be recording this, so you'll have access to the recording as well. So in terms of where we're heading, this is a map. Like all good maps, we may go off-road, and that's okay. So we're going to talk about the neuroscience of Shakespeare, and then this really bizarre collision between Shakespeare and special ops. We talk about how leaders think in story and why AI can't. And then specifically, we'll talk about how you can use your story. And then Angus is going to walk you through a brief diagnostic, and then walk you through the results on that. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. So if you have questions as we go throughout, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll answer the ones that we're able as we get there. So there we go. Over to you, Angus. Actually, just to get started, that is kind of that weird. Tell us about that weird collision of, you're a Shakespeare guy and the neuroscience of Shakespeare. And I know when people see you walk down the street, they're like, that guy is also probably a special operator as well. Not really. So how did you get from that to working with that community?
Yeah, I'm the least special operator person ever. I think I might have been the worst athlete in the history of my high school. I went to a high school that was one of those tiny high schools that had maybe about 200 or 300 people in it. And I was so inept as a senior in high school that I couldn't even get onto any of the ninth grade teams. So I'm the worst athlete in history. I'm the last person you want to hand a gun to. I'm not actually even interested in guns or firearms or any of these kinds of things. What I've spent my life doing is studying how story works in the human brain. And for a long time, I was considered to be a maverick, possibly crazy researcher. But starting out, maybe about 25 years ago now, I was working at the University of Michigan in the medical school in the neurophysiology lab. And I just had this insight that the human brain thinks in action. That's the purpose of a human life, is to act in the world, is to act in new ways, is to act in ways that change life. And the human brain drives that by coming up with new actions and by chaining together actions into new narratives. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to study that. And I wanted to understand how that works. And because at the time, everyone in neuroscience labs thought of the human brain as a computer, you couldn't really study that in neuroscience. And so I went off and started studying Shakespeare and started trying to figure out how Shakespeare thought. And then I worked a little bit in Hollywood and places like that, studying film directors and other people who had big imagination. And so for a long time, I was considered to be this maverick. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, I get a knock on the door from someone who introduces himself as being from the Army. And naturally, I was alarmed. And I said, why is the Army coming to talk to me? And they said, Professor Fletcher, we know that everyone thinks that you're kind of nuts, but we actually think that you might be onto something here. We're really interested in these ideas you have about imagination and intuition. And, we're wondering if you can come and maybe work with some of our elite teams, some of our special operators, because we think that actually they've converged on a lot of the same insights that you have. And we think that if we put you together with them, you guys might have the full picture of what human intelligence actually is. And it turns out, lo and behold, special operators think like Shakespeare. They have these enormous powers of imagination. They have these abilities to anticipate the future. They have the ability to drive innovation. And I think most importantly, they have the ability to exist in changing times. So the thing about Shakespeare that makes him really extraordinary was he was born in this moment of just tremendous upheaval. And that upheaval caused a lot of crisis and anxiety for people, but it also produced a lot of opportunity because there were chances to do new things. And this, of course, is the time known as the Renaissance, where so much modern culture and science was produced. And what special operators do in a different context is they head into these very volatile environments that are full of danger, that are full of threats, that are full of challenges, but they're also full of opportunities, chances to influence the course of human events. And like Shakespeare's mind, what they're able to do is they're able to seize very rapidly on emerging opportunities and then leverage those into new plans that transform the environment. And so special operators were smarter than me. They realized that the research that I was doing was research into their own thought. And they realized that, Shakespeare was the first special operator. So that's kind of how we got together. And I think maybe to kind of make this relevant to all the members of the audience who are not either Shakespeareans or special operators, what we could talk about is how this insight has kind of cashed out in schools, but also in business, to give people a kind of a new understanding of what makes their brain unique, what's powerful about their brain, and why it is that they're not going to be replaced by artificial intelligence, and how it is that we can start to cultivate environments where we use artificial intelligence as a tool and for all the things that it's good at. But we also start to cultivate this unique human power in ourselves to operate without information, to operate without tons of data, because that's what artificial intelligence can't do. Artificial intelligence is great at using data to perfectly predict yesterday. But what can we do as humans? We can act to make a tomorrow that has never existed before. So,
well, I think just to jump in on that real quick, I think there's always been loads of uncertainty, but I think we're all feeling, regardless of the field we're in, we're feeling that much more uncertainty over the past 5+ years, whether it's health or economy or politics or whatever it is. We used to at least have the illusion that we could control what was going on, right? And so that ability to be able to operate on not a lot of data, I think is very compelling. But yeah, take us through it in the day.
No, that's right. And what do we need now when there's little information? We need leaders. We need leaders. I mean, that's really because leaders are people who step first in the absence of certainty. Anytime you feel uncertain, you take a step forward, you're leading. And one of the things that is fascinating, this is something that just came up through my research, is that the same parts of the brain that go active when you're telling a story go active in leaders. Why is that? Well, because as a leader, you're essentially imagining a story of the future. Yep. You're saying, this is where it is that we can go. And then your job as a leader is to get everyone else to take that step with you. Another way of thinking about this, to kind of break it down, is another word for a story, is a plot, is a plan. So leaders are people who are able to make plans that are new plans, that are able to respond to new environments. And so anyone out there who's a good storyteller, you can be a leader. Almost anyone out there who's an effective leader is a good storyteller, because they're able to communicate these plans to the people around them in such a way that those people get excited and start to follow. And then the second piece of information to start the talk off with is that AI cannot think in story. This is something we could talk about for hours and hours and hours. And this has actually caused me a lot of hate online. So we probably shouldn't talk too much about this, because people are like, you don't understand computers and you don't understand story and you don't understand all these kinds of things. But just to be very, very brief about it, I've spent almost a decade now working in artificial intelligence or around artificial intelligence with natural language processors. Computers think in language. Language is different from story. Language we think is maybe 100,000 years old. It might be a little bit older than that, but it hasn't been around for that long. Story is very, very ancient. It goes back hundreds of millions of years. How do we know this? We know this because crows and birds can think in story. We know this because they can make plans. They can make plans. And the common evolutionary ancestor between us and a bird goes back before the Tyrannosaurus Rex. So the ability to think in story is much, much older than language. And
can you talk about, because you talk about in Wonderworks and elsewhere, you talk about story as the oldest technology. Is that, I'm curious why you're calling it a technology.
Because over time, what we have learned to do is take the set of actions from one brain and put them into another brain. So when we start to be able to kind of share stories between individuals, and you can do that without language, you can just move your body in a particular way and then somebody imitates you. So this happens a lot in animals. Animals will see one animal doing something and then they'll imitate it. And that's essentially that chain of actions, that story passing from one animal to the other animal. And then as humans, we've become much more expert at this, and we can have all sorts of films and plays and poems and all sorts of things like that, which are much more effective at moving story. But really, this is a way that we have of passing the ability to imagine, to make plans from one organism to another. So that's why I think of it as a technology. It's something that's invented on top of life, but isn't necessarily intrinsic to biology.
Gotcha.
So anyway, if AI cannot think in story, and story is the key to leadership, that means that AI is not going to lead us anywhere. And so what that means is, for anyone who wants to be a leader of the future, the question is, what's the story? What's the story? What's the story that I come up with as a leader? And for every leader, that story will be different, because every leader is unique. And that's the key thing about leadership. But we do know that there are certain commonalities about the stories that leaders tell themselves. And at a root level, as a leader, the most important story is the story you tell yourself about yourself. Because on a core level, leadership is about you yourself taking the first step before you try and convince other people to take that step. And with a lot of leaders, they just naturally go forward and then turn around and invite other people to follow them. And so it's that story you're telling yourself about your own future that's the most important story.
So when you're going back to your years and years of people perceiving you as crazy, or you believing people perceived you as crazy, but you keep pushing through, right? Like that lag time between your vision of the future and it starting to happen. What story were you telling yourself in that gap?
Well, I mean, that's great, Chris. And thank you. Yeah, because that's exactly right. I just kept telling myself the story over and over and over and over again. And that story was the story of story. I mean, that story was the belief that we as humans could think in story, and that at some point I was going to figure out a way to convince other people to go along with me. It was a long time in the academic wilderness for me. I mean, 15, 20 years. I had a lot of my mentors kind of pull me aside and say, you're a really smart guy. Why'd you keep doing this really weird thing? Why don't you kind of get back on the academic bandwagon and so on and so forth, But over time, people have started to kind of come around to this. And I'm sure everyone who's watching this has had a similar moment in their life where they've seen something that other people haven't seen. We've all had that experience. And what we know is that when children see something that other people haven't seen, they go for it, but that most adults hesitate. And really what we want to do is we want to actually start to say, no, if you see something that other people don't see, go for it. That's leading. And the most effective way to start to develop that ability is to start telling yourself that story that you are a leader. So what does that story of leadership look like? Again, every leader is different, so there's not a single story. But what we find in effective leaders is that they have generally this narrative structure in their brain. And this narrative structure is very simple. It's an integrated past and a branching future. And what that means is that when you look back on your past, you feel that you are a single person going on a single journey. And all the different things that happen to you on that journey click together to support your narrative in some way. And all the different actions that you took were actions that fit together as actions of the same person. So that's what we mean by an integrated past. And branching future means that you feel that there are many different ways that you could go tomorrow. There's all sorts of different ways you could be flexible. And what this does is this gives you the combination of long-term strategy and short-term flexibility. And that's because your momentum, like the momentum of a body of water, like a stream going down a mountain, your momentum comes from your past. So the more integrated your past, the more you're going to go in a continuous direction. If you hit a rock, what are you going to do? Because you have that short-term flexibility from your branching future, you're going to go around the rock, and then you're going to return to your historical course. And so this structure is what allows you both to be consistent in the long term, but also responsible and reactive in the short term, so you don't get stuck. And of course,
I think what's really interesting is like, if, you know, we're building a narrative with Microsoft can't come out to, you know, the markets and everyone else and be like, hey, we've got 3 potential futures and we're going to experiment with those. And so here's these 3 potential narratives. Like it would not go well, right? But with individuals, I like Herminio Barra's work on this, is when, you know, worked with leaders who are, I believe, midlife career transitions. And most people say, oh, I did this, this, and this. That's how I got here. And what she found over time through her study is that people that actually experimented with different possible futures were the ones that succeeded, right? So that idea of experimentation and potential different branches, if you will, is really powerful.
Yeah, because life is always changing. And you just don't know what the opportunities or problems are going to be in the moment. And so you have to have that flexibility. But of course, at the same time, you also have to have that long-term sense of direction, which comes from your past, you know, and it's that balance which allows you to be flexible in the moment without losing yourself. And I think what we see with a lot of people nowadays is if they're flexible, they get lost because they don't have that long-term sense of history, or they're very rooted in their ways. And as a result, they don't get anywhere. And so this is why leaders who are effective are able to kind of merge the two by keeping the solidity in their past and branching their future. And of course, the opposite of this is people who have what we would call a disaggregated past. So that's a past where they are multiple people. You know, they have all these different parts of their life they can't fit together. They don't understand what they were doing during those last 6 years of their life or something. It just seems like a whole or something like that. Or there are moments of where, you know, experiences happen that they can't reconcile with their view of life. You know, and then their future is like, it's got to be this one thing. There's only one path for me. Almost all the students I talk with nowadays, they have a very narrow sense of their future. They're like, I've got to get into this one school, or I've got to get into this one job. And what that means is that you tend to be very directionless in the long term and very inflexible in the short term. And it's a really bad combination, as you might imagine. So this is what you want. And what we find is that in 4-year-olds, this is how their brain naturally is. If you look at the average story that a 4-year-old is telling herself, it's this story. She has a pretty good sense of where she came from, but she's open to the future. So as children, we naturally have this structure. And this is the structure that you don't want. And this is the structure actually of post-traumatic stress. So Chris, you and I have worked with a lot of veterans. This is what happens a lot when you go to combat, because combat puts you in these situations which kind of shatter your sense of progress, but they also give you this sense of inflexibility in the short term. And this is also the structure that most adults increasingly have now. So most of us are going from a healthy state at the age of 4 to an unhealthy state. And how do you get out of this? Well, the first thing to do is start to self-diagnose and ask yourself, which part of my mental story is causing me the most problems right now? Is it my past? Is it my future? Is my past too disaggregated, or is my future too narrow? And the way we do that is through our emotions. The connection between emotion and narrative is something I'm sure everyone's familiar with. That's why when you watch a movie, it makes you cry or laugh or whatever. You know, stories stimulate strong emotions in the brain. But stories, the reason those emotions exist biologically isn't so that, you know, you can weep or cry at your favorite movie. The reason those emotions exist biologically is so that you can analyze your own life story. Your emotions evolve to help you say, this is what's going on in my own narrative. And so if you feel shame or grief, if you reflect on your past and you feel very strong sensations of shame or grief, that's your brain saying your past is disaggregated. It's coming apart. And in particular, shame is when you feel that you're two people. So if you look at moments and you feel very strong shame, what your brain is telling you is, hey, you acted in a way in that moment that you feel is different from the way that you should have acted. So you've now become two different people, the person who acted that way and the person who you want to be. And you've got to work to close that gap to integrate your past. Grief occurs when something happens that you can't reconcile with your picture of the world. You're like, that couldn't have happened. You know, when that person died in that way, that's impossible. That doesn't make sense with how I think about the world. You know, that project that I launched, it couldn't have collapsed in that way. That doesn't make sense. And that produces grief. And so you're living in two worlds in that moment. And so if you review your past and you start to feel those, that's your brain's way of saying, hey, you've got to do a little bit of work and heal that. And then if you think about your future and you start to feel a lot of stress, or if you start to feel anger. And what we find with a lot of people who could be effective leaders but are failing is they get put in challenging situations and they get angry. They start to get irritable with the people around them. They start to get short-tempered. And that's because their brain is telling them it's got to be this way. It's got to be this way. It's got to be this way. And so if you reflect on your future and you start to feel tense or angry, that's a sign, hey, my future is narrowing. And so once you kind of review yourself and start to think about these emotional indicators, the next step is to start to do that story work. And as you and I have talked about, Chris, one of the things that you've done and one of the things that's brought us together is a lot of work you've done in the veterans community, helping individuals work through shame and grief, and then taking that work from the veterans community and just doing it generally with other people in business and other areas to find that integrity in their life story.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is the self-evaluation piece can be very tricky, right? Because most people in the moment are not going to be able to say like, hey, I'm feeling shame and it's tied to this thing, right? To your point, I really like that explanation of it manifests as anger and stress, right? But a lot of those stories are buried. I think the first story that comes to mind was this group of Marines, and two of them, so we did a reunion in Montana, and I think they hadn't seen each other in 10, 12 years, some of them. And this one guy had essentially ostracized himself for 12 years because he said, I'm not as good a Marine as they are. And he had shame around that, and I could have done more. And another guy tried to bail the day of the trip, right? Probably for similar reasons. But the first guy said when he showed up, he said in an instant, all that shame, all of that was gone. And it was just like they were back together, right? But that belief, that narrative was instantly gone, right? But what it took is a shift in environment and state to be close to them, that community piece. But then it also took an experience, and then it also took a place for him to tell that story and process it, right? And be able to tell that. But that's one of the most powerful ones I've ever seen, where it's just that almost kind of instantaneous flip.
Yeah, and so the thing to remember about shame and grief, like you're talking about, is shame and grief are created by your brain. They're created by your brain. They don't come from outside your brain. We often think of shame and grief as being imposed upon us from outside. No, your brain creates them. And your brain creates them because it wants you to remember something specifically with this strong emotion. So you go back and you look at it. And in the modern world, we're not really equipped to deal with shame and grief. So we push it aside, when really what our brain wants us to do is go back and tell that story to ourselves and learn from that story. And so what you're talking about in the case of this Marine, it sounds like, is he had this strong sense of shame based on maybe, some of his memories of how he felt he had conducted himself. And that made him feel like he wasn't worthy of being a Marine. And then he got back into this circle, and then he started sharing those stories. He started telling those stories. And then when he saw the acceptance of the other Marines and the other Marines saying, yeah, we've been in situations like that. I mean, that's what happens in war. That's what happens in combat. You're faced with these very challenging situations. And in retrospect, you wish you'd gone this way, you'd done that way instead, but, so on and so forth, And then when he was able to tell that story out loud, process it and learn from it, gain that wisdom, he gained that integrity. And to your point about people bailing on trips, I do a lot of work with the Satterleys, Tom and Jen Satterley, and we do a lot of the work with couples, basically. And I think most people's deepest shame surrounds their relationships. If we're honest about it, it's not their careers, it's their relationships that cause them the deepest shame. And they think back on that. And every time we run one of these retreats, there will be couples who just don't come. They bought the plane tickets, they've done everything, and they don't come because they don't want to tell the story. But when you do come and you do tell the story, that's the first step of developing that integrity, because the moment you start sharing it with other people, you start being able to understand why your brain remembered it, and you start to be able to take that pain and turn it into wisdom. All wisdom comes from pain. All strength comes from pain. All comes from processing those stories. So that's the first part. And then as far as branching your future, the chapter that everyone's going to get from the book, that's about intuition and activating intuition. And so if you, upon doing this kind of self-analysis, you think about your future and you start to feel, angry or stressed about it, that chapter will kind of walk you through some of the steps of reactivating your childhood intuition to start seeing possibilities, to start kind of branching tomorrow. And that should help you kind of start to kind of shift your narrative in those ways. And, it's not just about you. Maybe there's someone who you feel is struggling with these things, if you can create a space for them to start to talk about how they felt grief or how they felt shame, or if you can create a space for them to start activating their intuition and spotting the exceptional, you'll see that they start to integrate their past, branch their future, and naturally activate this power that we all have inside us to be leaders. Because this is the one thing I do believe. I believe that everyone is born a leader. I think that if you go back a few 100,000 years, what you find is that humans evolved in these environments where you could be 20 years old and you could be basically the oldest person in your community, and a disaster would strike and you would have to figure out how to get everyone else through it. And we have inherited from those people who survived that capacity to lead. Everyone who's on earth now has as one of their ancestors those leaders. So that's something that's natural to all of us.
But what do you think about, because I could hear someone thinking as, they're looking at this like, hey, we're talking about, special operators here, right? So this very elite, very small, select group of people. And like, hey, my world at, XYZ company as a leader is nothing like that. And I don't have this kind of thing in my past. I don't have shame and grief in my past, or, I'm not dealing with massive trauma or things like that. I've seen that's actually a lot more common than people think, but I'm curious your thoughts on like, how does this apply across everyone?
Well, the thing that we find with most adults, even if they're not struggling with large amounts of shame and grief, is that they have pretty high levels of anxiety and anger at work. And a lot of that is due from this sense that they have to do things the right way, which is this sense that there is a correct existing answer out there. And if I don't do that correct answer that everyone's expecting, I'm going to be judged and I'm going to have problems. And really, the whole point of leadership is to start to acknowledge that there are not right answers. There are not right answers. There are just possible answers. And we're going to try those answers as quickly as we can. I also say to people, look, you might be an extraordinary leader. You might be an incredible leader. This training may be totally useless to you personally because you may already have the capacity to do all these things that I'm talking about. But if that's the case, then one other thing we've discovered from working with special operations is that the better people are as leaders, the worse they are at training the people around them to be leaders. And this is known as the tacit knowledge problem. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but basically the better you are at something, the harder it is for you to explain to other people how to do it. So if you're like a great guitarist, you can never explain to other people how to play the guitar. You try and you try and you try, but it's like impossible. If you're a great surgeon, it's very hard for you to communicate to people how you move your fingers because that knowledge is tacit knowledge in your head. And so one of the things that we do with special operations is we go to them and say, hey, you guys are all natural leaders. You know this, or same thing when we go to business, but the folks around you might be struggling. There might be a lot of people on your team that are struggling to step up. You give them a job to do and they don't do it as effectively as you think that they could do. They're getting in their own way. They're hesitating. They're displaying a lack of initiative, or they're displaying a lack of imagination, or they have a lack of emotional confidence in themselves. These are all really common things that we see in people when they're struggling in the workplace. Well, in that case, give them this training. Sit them down, give them an hour coaching session. You will transform their lives by helping them access this part of their own intelligence.
Yeah, I actually spoke to a group recently, and one of the guys at the beginning was a group of entrepreneurs. And I don't know quite what was behind this, but he said, yeah, I don't know if you've worked with people like us before. Like what it sounded like was like, we're hard charging entrepreneurs. We have it together. We have our emotions together, all of that. And what's so fun for me is the people I'm generally working with are the people that are about as far away as you can imagine from doing this kind of work, meaning type A operators, no emotion. But they go through these like transformations. I have this one client who literally the way he would describe his internal narrative was knocking mother effers out. That's how he viewed business and life. He's like, there's a line in front of me, I knock one out, then I knock the next one out, then I knock the next one out. And I remember asking him to share in our first workshop session to share a story from his childhood of when he felt pride or joy from something he did with no input from anyone else, no feedback from anyone else. And he got aggressively angry. And he's like, I didn't have anything like that. My childhood was a disaster. I was like, whoa, okay. And there was no getting to it. 2 weeks later, he comes back and he's like, you're not going to believe what happened. I'm sitting in the sauna, not thinking about this. And a story hits me like lightning from when I was a kid. I was in this canoe race, won the race. And it was like 15 minutes of pure joy telling the story. A year on, I'm talking to him and he said, I used to never experience joy. Now I experience joy every day. Not a lot, but a little. But what's interesting is in the space he's in now, he's also now, and I obviously can't correlate it directly, but he's now in a place where he's figuring out what the future looks like. And it's a far more positive narrative than knocking mother effers out. And it's bringing joy and a lot of other gifts to the world, which is pretty powerful.
Yeah, well, that's a tremendous story, Chris, and thank you for sharing that. And what that goes to show is a lot of people who are very successful in this world are actually inhabiting a kind of survival psychology, to your point, right? Where maybe because of childhood pressures or childhood stresses, they had to kind of grow up fast. There's this metaphor that the special operators often like to use called little frogs. If you stress out tadpoles, they turn into frogs faster. They undergo metamorphosis faster, but they also turn into little frogs, because they didn't have that whole period to grow.
Yeah.
And so a lot of, very, very effective people are little frogs, and they need to actually take that time and grow. And when they grow, they start to realize, oh, I'm not just here surviving. I'm not just fighting for my own. I'm here and I have the capacity to experience joy and give joy to others. I can become a big frog. I can be someone who takes care of the world and sets up future generations not to have to go through some of the tragedy that I did. Okay. So that's the kind of big picture on that story stuff. And I thought it might be fun, if people are interested, to take a couple minutes now and take this free diagnostic that we have up on the website, up on Operation Human. We'll give you a couple minutes to do this. Basically, it'll run you through about 20 questions. None of your data is kept or recorded. You're not asked to sign up for anything. There's nothing like that. But it'll run you through kind of a short series of questions that are similar to the questions that we run with special operators, and it will give you, as its output, your leading primal power, which is the kind of primal power that you are most effective at, and it will give you your limiting primal power, which is the primal power which might be kind of holding you back, and which might be the first one that you want to target. So should we just kind of hang out for 2 minutes, Chris? Or
yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so tell me, you got your results. I got my results, which are the same result that I always get.
Oh, and you got Van Gogh on here. Someone actually, a friend described, my son was at this group, and this friend who knows me well, someone in the group says, "Oh, Ethan, tell me about your dad." And my friend describes me. He's like, "Chris is a genius. He's like Van Gogh. The guy's just absolutely brilliant. But like Van Gogh, he might also cut off his ear at any moment." I was like, that's kind of hilarious and amazing. But yeah, no, I got intuition was mine.
So you've got the power to spot exceptions to rules, which is, of course, the reason that Van Gogh was in that position is when you can spot exceptions to rules, you see things that the people around you don't see. You see the future faster. And as a result, you feel the sense of frustration and alienation from your environment because you're constantly living 3 seconds ahead of everybody, or maybe even 3 years to 300 years ahead of everybody. And there's that frustration to try and show people what it is you understand. If you've ever read Van Gogh's letters, you'll feel that frustration. He's like, why can people not see this? Why is no one buying my art? This is brilliant. And of course, we've all caught up to him, as we're going to catch up to you, Chris, in a couple of years, I hope. But that's that power, right? So your leading power is intuition.
Common sense was my lagging.
Well, this is very bad, Chris, because my lagging power is also common sense. So we have two of the least commonsensical people on this podcast, which is probably why it's not as successful as it could be. Because the truth is when your limiting power is common sense, you typically underperform in real world situations. And a good example of this is that if you're a creative person, if you have kind of creative tendencies, you'll tend to be creative even when you don't need to be creative if you have low common sense. In other words, you're just constantly doing things that you find interesting as opposed to being boring in boring situations. So that's what happens when your limiting power is common sense. As you've probably intuited, my leading power is emotion, which means I have very kind of strong self-knowledge. I've got pretty bad intuition and imagination, not quite as bad as common sense, but pretty bad. But my power of emotion is pretty strong because I have a strong sense of self. I have a strong sense of like, this is my purpose, this is my mission. And if I didn't have that, I probably would have quit a long time ago. And the main takeaway from this is, first of all, intuition, imagination, emotion, common sense. These are all terms you've heard before, but most of the ways they're talked about in the modern world, they're talked about as though they're either magical or they're talked about somehow they can be reduced to logic. And so if you read Daniel Kahneman or any AI, they'll tell you that intuition is pattern matching or something like that. But as we discovered from working with special operators, it's the opposite of that. It's seeing the exception to a rule. It's breaking the pattern. This is the thing that computers can't do. Same thing with something like common sense. People will say, well, common sense is just a kind of like statistical probability or something like that. But if that were the case, then computers would have common sense, which they don't. And there's a ton of good research out there which shows computers have no common sense whatsoever. And it's because common sense is not about data. It's about the ability to be intelligent with little or no data. And of course, computers don't have emotion. And when people try and understand emotion logically, they often talk about things like EQ and things like that, which has been pretty aggressively scientifically debunked. And that's because EQ assumes that somehow you can know what other people are thinking or feeling, when in reality, what emotion does is it tells you what's going on in your own head. I mean, that's obvious, biologically at least. And so the main point here is that these are all kind of different ways of thinking about these core abilities that come to you once you sort of start thinking in terms of narrative and biology as opposed to logic and AI. And the big takeaway is that all of us are typically good at least one of these. And that's what gives us our kind of edge in life. But we have the ability to be good at all four of them. And most of us don't take that opportunity because we just kind of get by being good at one of them. So if you're good at intuition, you typically get by having these like brilliant ideas constantly, so you have tons and tons of brilliant ideas. And then every once in a while, one of them will work out and that's enough for you, right? When in reality, if you developed your common sense, then every brilliant idea you had could make you rich, right? Or whatever. So all of us have this way in which, just because of the way life works, we tend to be good at one thing and we just kind of soldier on with that one thing. But the idea behind the book is, no, you can start to develop all of these. And to motivate people to do this development, what I talk about is when you start pairing these abilities together, you start getting other powers, what I call these primal abilities. And so if you want to be an innovator, where does that come? Well, that comes from pairing intuition with imagination. Because what intuition does is it sees the opportunity and then imagination turns that into a plan, turns it into an action. And so we see people who are good innovators, we see that they score high in both of these. If you want to have resilience, that comes from imagination and emotion. Why? The emotion helps you know who you are and the imagination helps you adapt to changing circumstances. So it gives you a combination of grit from the emotion, but also adaptability from imagination. And that pairing is what allows people to survive the most challenging situations. Decision-making, you've got to have common sense, obviously, but you've also got to have the imagination to see a variety of decisions because good decisions match the moment. So you've got to have that wide slate of choices in order to be able to activate your common sense. And so someone like Warren Buffett, he has very, very high imagination and very, very high common sense. And he's also pretty honest about the fact that he's not that great at math or statistics or AI or any of this kind of stuff. So it's definitely a primal thought process in him. Good communicators are high in common sense and high in emotion. Why? The emotion allows them to know who they are and therefore what it is they want to say. And the common sense allows them to meet their audience. I'm a pretty poor communicator a lot of the time because I've got high emotion and bad common sense. So I always know what it is that I want to say, and then I'm usually dreadful at figuring out how to communicate it to other people. So I write like very weird books that people are like, it could have been a lot simpler if you just said it this way. So I kind of demand.
That was a pamphlet, not a 400-page book.
But that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. But if you're a good communicator, right, you have these two. And if you want to be a better communicator and you're good at common sense, then you just need to up your emotion a little. Or if you're good at emotion, you just need to up your common sense a little, and you'll see your communication abilities improve. If you're struggling for life purpose, that comes from a combination of emotion and intuition. Why? Well, emotion tells you your story, and intuition helps you see what's special about yourself. And so we find that people who have strong life purpose are very high in both of these. Coaching, this is the ability to get the best out of other people. That comes from intuition, which is spotting what's unique about them. So you can see what's exceptional about each person that comes into your life, but you have the common sense to match your coaching to them. So you're not always trying to coach them in the same way. You'll see that some coaches are good with some, kids, and then not so good with other kids, and that's not really great coaching, right? That's just that you happen to find a kid who happens to understand your coaching style, but great coaches are able to coach anyone because they have the common sense to be able to be flexible. And then finally, of course, leadership comes from all four. And this is the part that we work a lot with special operators. So that's a kind of big overview of sort of how the book works and kind of how Primal works in general. You kind of start by identifying what you're good at. And when you read the book and it kind of explains back to you why you're good at it, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? That's kind of how my brain works, right? And what we find is that when we give people the book, a lot of people just stop there. They're like, yes, I am great at intuition. This is wonderful. And then they put the book down, right? They say, oh yes, I have a lot of common sense. They put the book down, or they give the book to other people and say, look how good I am at common sense. Read about me, But actually the point of the book is not to validate you, although it's good to be validated, right? Everyone needs to be validated. It's to say, hey, what about these other parts of your brain that you could train up, you could get better. And then, those chapters are harder to read. I don't understand them as easily. Well, that's the point, right? Read them, get better at them, or, find someone in your life who is good at those things and then form a partnership and coach each other up. And the main thing there is that this is not like a Myers-Briggs thing where you get like put in a type and then you're stuck there. The point of this isn't to be like, you have high intuition and that means you're doomed never to have these other capacities. The point of it is to be like, as a child, you were probably roughly equal in all four of these areas. And as an adult, you've really gone into one quadrant or the other because that's kind of been your survival space. Start to go back to your childhood capacity and unlock those other powers in yourself and start to become your complete self and start to become a true and total leader.
Awesome. I love this. Thank you, Angus. Let's open it up to questions. There's been awesome engagement. Lots from Masa, Bill, Jenny, Amanda, Trent, on and on. So tee up those questions. I've got questions, but let's pause for a minute and give people a chance to ask some questions.
So I don't see the feed, Chris. You'll have to read them out to me since all I can see is you and me. And hopefully this will, you'll just screen out any hecklers,
It's been pretty aggressive, actually.
Yeah. Okay. That's that's my fear.
Why didn't Angus button the bottom button of his shirt? That one came through. Joanne just had a comment. She said, that's my cheat sheet. I partner with the people who are strong at the others. And that, honestly, so I like the challenge to develop those other areas. But also I think as people who often in our culture, at least, try and function alone, that team piece and building it together is super powerful.
Yeah, and teams are great. And there's no question that teams are more effective than individuals. I mean, this is one of the things you see with U.S. Army Special Operations is that these teams come together and do extraordinary things that individuals can't. But you also realize that if you're going to be put in a leadership position, at some point, you're going to be asked to do kind of all these four things because you're going to be out there on your own. And so there is this opportunity, if you want to take it, to develop these other things. And what we have found, we've done a bunch of these trainings in companies. And what we do, it's super simple. And you can steal this idea and use it to start your own company, your own consulting business if you want. Is what we do is we go through and we do like an evaluation of people in the company. And we find the people who are high in intuition, for example, and low in common sense. Then we find the people who are high in common sense and low in intuition. And we partner them. And we say, coach each other, help them through this situation. And your brain is very, very good at learning from other people once you start to kind of open it up. And if you're not learning from other people, it may be because you've got like a kind of a buried memory in your past, maybe a shame memory or a sense of like, I can't do that, or I tried to do that. And then you can call Chris and Chris will coach you through it. He'll be like, hey, yeah, sure. There was that time you tried to have common sense, Angus, and it didn't work out. And I can be honest with you, I don't want to pretend like I have Warren Buffett's level of common sense, because I do not. But when I first started working with special operators, they pulled me aside and they said, we've never seen anyone with less common sense than you. I mean, never. I was like, oh, really? They're like, yeah. They're like, and we work with a lot of people who have pretty low common sense, because basically if you spend a lot of time interacting with technology, that's going to drop your common sense. If you spend a lot of time in a classroom, that's going to drop your common sense. And so I said to them, I spend all my time on technology and in a classroom. And they're like, huh, interesting. Yeah, well, that's why you have literally zero common sense. And they've coached me up, and I don't want to, as I said, I don't want to pretend like I have a lot of common sense, but you will see me now, and I have significantly more common sense than I had a couple of years ago. And the Army has promised me that if I keep at it, I can keep sort of inching up that scale. And that's how it is for all of us. I mean, all of us have the ability to grow these abilities, and it's fun to grow. I mean, it's fun to kind of get better at stuff that you don't think of yourself as good at. It's fun to surprise people by suddenly having that intuition. If you're like the common sense person, suddenly having the intuition and beating all of your friends to the future. So I do just want to put it out there that yes, teams are amazing. Teams are incredible, particularly if you're trying to get somebody to work now, you're going to want that partnership, but there is that growth opportunity in all of us. I've seen it happen.
So Tina asked if you've done any work with neurodivergent brains. I've got one of those, and curious how that intersects with this work.
Yeah, I do a lot of work with individuals who identify as neurodivergent. And, the reality of autism or ADHD or any of the other kinds of things that we label as neurodivergence is that they're individual. And I think that the way that you sort of help individuals who say to you, I can't do this, because, my brain works this way or my brain works that way, is you sit them down and you say, okay, I totally agree that this challenge right now is overwhelming, or this challenge is intense, or so on and so forth. But let's walk through your past when you did something that surprised you about yourself. Let's start to kind of develop and kind of strengthen that sense that you have, not of you as someone who has failed in all these ways, or not as someone who is unnormal or incompetent in ways that society expects you to be. But let's start to walk back through your memory of times when you surprised yourself by doing something that's really hard. And hey, if you can't remember that, I'm going to remind you of a time when you did something really hard. Do you remember that time you did something really hard? Yeah, I know it happened because I saw it. And so a big part of the work that we do with all individuals is we help them reclaim their own story. Because what happens increasingly in the modern world is the modern world has this very inflexible sense of, how people should behave, frankly. It's like when you go and you hang out with the Air Force, and you realize that every pilot is supposed to be exactly the same size, because like the cockpit is that way, and if you're not that size, you can't be a pilot, and it's like, no, actually, even though the world wants to standardize everything for efficiency's sake, what makes the world powerful is the uniqueness and originality of each person. Every person has something special and unique about them. And that is ultimately, that uniqueness is ultimately what contributes to society and makes it better. So we're going to start by pulling you out of the shame cycle of this kind of, standardized approach to everything. Identify something that you're proud of that's, unique in you, strengthen that part of your brain, and then identify your next challenge. And then we're going to walk through together as you go through that challenge. And so that's another perhaps a long-winded way of saying that when I deal with neurodivergent individuals or individuals who identify as neurodivergent, I treat them just like any other individual. And I just start with helping them affirm their own story. I start by helping them say, here's what's good and strong and proud about me, something I'm proud about in terms of my life history. And here's the next challenge I want to tackle. Let's do it together.
So we've got about 5 more minutes, so we'll maybe do these last ones as pretty rapid fire. So someone asked, how should leaders balance multiple future paths with ensuring focus in the present?
Yeah, so the key as a leader is you've got to have your strategic vision. And that's what allows you to have focus. And strategic vision comes from your past. There's a long bit about this in the book, which I can't talk about now. But basically, the more effective you are as a leader at developing your strategic vision, the more you'll be able to kind of balance. And common sense is what helps you as a leader determine which short-term path is going to get you fastest to your target destination. So as a leader, what you're always trying to go for is that sense of strategic clarity with tactical flexibility. Common sense gives you the tactical flexibility, and your sense of your past gives you that long-term goal.
Awesome. Then Joanne asks, where does AI plot on the grid, if it plots it at all?
So AI doesn't have any of these abilities. That's what's kind of awesome about this, is that AI has tremendous powers, which we're starting to become aware of, at detecting patterns, at sort of synthesizing information, but it doesn't have the ability to imagine. It only has the ability to ideate. It doesn't have emotion. It doesn't have the ability to plan, is another way of saying it. So this is your human edge. AI is a tool. You as a human are the leader. You say, here's what I want AI to do. Chris has done some great AI work to promote this event. All came out of his imagination. So AI can't do any of this. And I've actually just been tasked by my university with putting this in the core curriculum of our university, directly as a result of tests we've done over the last year with students in AI, and realizing that this is something that not only AI can't do, but students are getting worse at the more that they use AI.
So there's a question I'm going to ask. I don't think you should answer it. I don't think it's safe to answer. In which quadrant do you find most Michigan fans fall?
Yeah, obviously Michigan fans don't even qualify. Oh, this is actually a time for me to reveal a very dark secret, which is, of course, I actually got one of my degrees at Michigan. So this is something that had to be expunged from the Ohio State website due to the fact that they have common sense and I do not have common sense. And I put it on the website initially.
Awesome. Paul asks, while leading story at NASA JPL, we discovered, and this question makes me very happy because I'm excited. I know where you're going to go. While leading story at NASA JPL, we discovered the power of a shared story in optimizing team dynamics. It's more of a kindred quest versus a hero's journey. Do you see Primal as a leader's hero's journey, or more of guiding a kindred quest?
I mean, kindred quest, of course. Paul, thank you. Paul Propster, one of my heroes on the call right now. And of course, I mean, putting a person on the moon. I mean, what was that? I mean, that was saying, here's our strategic vision. And then it was pulling together thousands and thousands of people, many of them very young, to figure out, here's how I am a character in this larger story, in this larger journey. So it's not about one hero winning, dominating, taking over. It's about all of us working together to figure out how our stories contribute to this larger enterprise that none of us could achieve alone. And that's really the story of our humanity, is to value the story, the individual story of each person you encounter, and then to see how that connects into this bigger story of our mutual tomorrow.
So then the final question is just a follow-up on the neurodivergence piece, that neurodivergent doesn't mean can't do or limited. I wonder if some neurodivergence lends itself to strengths in some of these quadrants.
Well, that's something that we have not tested. But I will tell you informally that almost all the operators I've ever worked with say that they have ADHD. And I'm a little skeptical that they all have ADHD. I think a lot of that occurs because when you put people in classrooms and other things like that, they naturally get restless. But I definitely think that there is a kind of predisposition to that kind of like active mind among operators. So it wouldn't surprise me, for example, if people who felt that they tended towards having ADHD were very high in intuition, as an example.
Yeah, I can track things very specifically, either from my ADHD or CPTSD, that create strengths that help me in that quadrant that I'm in. Yeah. But then there's also the flip side of the coin that I can see as well. So
100%.
Well, Angus, this has been an absolute blast.
This has been incredible. Thank you, Chris,
thank
for
you.
doing
I
this.
wish we could keep going.
yeah. This is phenomenal. Yeah. Well, we might do it again, right? I mean, I'll probably hop on your podcast pretty soon, and we'll have a chance to go for maybe a deep dive and talk about some more stuff. And hopefully we'll do some more events together, because I really incredibly respect the way that you are able to surface people's deep stories and turn what they feel are weaknesses or sources of disempowerment into their ultimate strength.
Well, thank you. That means a lot. I really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining. I will send out an email here shortly, and with a first chapter of the book, and encourage you to pre-order it today.
Take care, everyone. Thanks for joining us.